Hey, welcome to Crossroads, folks. There's a new poll out from New York Times. I know I don't really trust polls often, but this one is significant. Now, this new New York Times poll, it was released right alongside the Philadelphia Inquirer and Siena College, and the findings could send shockwaves through the entire Democrat Party, maybe even a few others, because it shows former President Donald Trump winning all swing states except Michigan. Now, in addition to that, it shows that RFK Jr. could take between 7 and 9% of the vote in swing states. And, although even without any third-party candidates included, they still project Trump as the winner by several points. Now, keep in mind, it's just a poll, but based on polling, typically Trump is actually better performing than the polls, not underperforming, which does suggest that, frankly, this poll showing Trump having a pretty solid victory, it could actually be even more so than less so. Now, look, they spoke with 4,097 people, registered voters over the course of about a week and a half, leading up to May 9th. I should note, polls are just polls. Take them as you will. But it's important because, of course, this is what's used for political strategy. And this one in particular seems to go against all logic they were using beforehand. The entire strategy up until very recently among the Democrats was basically, get Trump. Biden, of course, during most of his campaign speeches and so on, he was more criticizing Donald Trump. He was putting down Trump, talking about the MAGA extremists, talking about division being sowed by his alleged political enemies, to the extent that Barack Obama had to, according to reports, step in and tell Biden, hey, stop talking about Donald Trump. Focus more on your victories, focus on economics, focus on other things, but do not talk about Donald Trump. It looked like they put a lot of weight and a lot of hope behind the idea that Trump could get removed from the votes, and that's not happening, right? They tried to get him off the ballot. That agenda has largely failed. And so what you're watching now is the result of everything they tried. It has not worked, suggesting they need to try something drastically different that does not involve maybe getting Trump. It might actually have to involve significant policy changes or something, because they're on the track to lose by a significant margin right now. Now, the poll shows Biden only winning the vote among women by 2% as well. And, single women, not necessarily married women, single women tend to vote very strongly Democrat. Trump and Biden are also tied for the Hispanic vote at about 33%. Which is a big shift, because you might remember under Barack Obama, part of the whole mass migration strategy was the whole hope that if they brought in enough people from Latin America, they'd have a solid permanent voting base. They're losing that. They're losing the Hispanic vote. And maybe they miscalculated on, party affiliation versus just issue votes. And interestingly, a lot of them don't seem to be supporting what Biden is doing. Among black voters, they still very, very heavily swing for Biden. They're probably Biden's strongest voting base. They have about 58%. Trump has about just 12%. But even that's growth from what he had before. Even that's an increase. But importantly, another 10% of the black vote is going to RFK Jr., meaning that some of them are just choosing independent parties. There's still about 8% of voters who were undecided, which would be enough for, Biden to tie with Trump if he hypothetically got every single one of them. But that's not a winning strategy, just being blunt. You're not going to count on, of course, the undecided voters all in their entirety going to you, meaning that Biden would have to win over every single undecided voter and win votes from RFK Jr. and Trump, or maybe shut down the other third parties to get just a few extra percentage points and then somehow win all those votes himself if he's going to win the election. In other words, strategically, the current trajectory does not put them on a good path. The big question now is going to be, what will be the change in the trajectory? Remember, the strategy up until now has been get Trump. The strategy up till now has been prosecute Trump, get him off the ballot, call him extremist, talk about how he tried to, quote unquote, overthrow democracy. that strategy is not working. That strategy has failed. That strategy is not one they can continue and hope to win on. And of course, as I mentioned, RFK Jr. is taking a pretty solid number of votes as well. But even in projected races where it's only Trump and only Biden, Biden is still estimated to lose to Trump by several points. So what we can expect to watch now is a shift in policy. If they are actually trying to win this thing through normal means, let's say. We can expect them to actually change some policies based on this. We'll see if they actually do it. It might even just be a change in narrative. They might just keep doing what they're doing, but talk about it different. But this is the kind of poll that will have to change things. Now, speaking of which, meanwhile, Joe Biden is caught between a rock and a hard place, to put it nicely, with his party over the Israel-Hamas war. And the split among Democrats is also showing very heavily, notably in the party's biggest donors. Because interestingly, some of the biggest money behind the Democrats are either on the pro-Israel or the pro-Hamas/Palestine side. Now, news outlets have reported that Biden's biggest donors on each side of this conflict, on both sides, they're angry at Biden about his position with Israel and his position with Palestine. And, you know, Biden's attempt, it seems, has been to try to play both sides. He, of course, held his event alongside AOC, right, part of the squad, who's very much on the pro-Palestine side. He has members of his party like Rashida Tlaib and so on who are very pro-Palestine. He has others like John Fetterman openly criticizing him for not being pro-Israel enough. And interestingly, he's losing support from both sides by not going to one side or the other. This is not an issue he's finding you can take a middle ground on, which he's been trying to do. Which of course puts him in a very difficult place, because I think with the Israel-Hamas war, the main goal is the other regions. The main goal, of course, would be like a peace deal with, for example, Saudi Arabia and Israel. That would be the real goal at play. And so any other incidents along the way need to keep in mind that end goal. And so if Israel, for example, goes too far and basically loses the support of the entire Muslim world, that would be devastating to the possibility of a peace deal. And of course, a lot of people believe that that's what Iran was trying to prevent from happening, maybe by spurring Hamas forward with the attack on Israel. But then it also brings the very funny point that Biden just reopened a whole bunch of funding for Iran right before that happened. And has people wondering, well, what's really going on here? Back to the issue, though, of the money. Axios said this. He said, President Biden has become increasingly critical of Israel. He's going to the other side now. And note that some of his campaign's biggest pro-Israel donors are becoming more critical of him, notably because of this. And notes that Democratic mega donor and Israeli-American Haim Saban emailed senior White House officials Wednesday asking them to pass along his criticism of Biden's recent move to pause bomb shipments to Israel over a possible ground operation in Rafah. And he said, quote, bad decision on all levels. Please reconsider. He wrote in a message obtained by Axios and other news outlets. And he added, quote, let's not forget that there are more Jewish voters who care about Israel than Muslim voters who care about Hamas, according to, again, one of Biden's biggest donors. And it's the Biden campaign declined to comment on that. Now, it's not even just within his donors, though. Even from within his party, Biden is facing a lot of criticism. Briefly on this is what happened. Israel was, of course, planning the invasion of Rafah. Rafah is one of the regions of Palestine, or, the Gaza Strip, that has a lot of the refugees in it currently. Other countries, they're not opening their borders. Egypt isn't opening the gates and letting them through. A lot of these countries, Lebanon, Egypt, and so on, they've had bad experiences with the Palestinians previously. In fact, the Palestinians had launched terror attacks in some of these countries and got pushed out. The Palestinians are not wanted by much of the surrounding area because, again, they're seen, even in the Muslim world, they're seen as extreme. They're seen as brainwashed. They don't want them. And so a lot of them were stuck in Rafah. They're just stuck there. Biden was talking about bringing them to the U.S. We'll see what happens with that. Given that situation, though, Biden was saying if Israel is going to go into Rafah, and they say they have to do it to go after some of the last elements of Hamas strongholds in that area, that Biden was saying he would not back and not support Israel in that operation unless Israel could show evidence or a plan that their attack on Rafah would not kill civilians. They would take some efforts to prevent the killing of civilians. Biden said that Israel did not do that. They were not able to show a plan that would not plausibly prevent the killing of civilians. For Israel's part, they're noting that the way that Hamas fights, it's almost impossible to not kill civilians because they tend to hide among or hide behind civilians when they fight, which of course means it's a war that's also just a giant hostage situation, and they're questioning how do you fight a war like that? It's a very difficult situation, frankly. Now, Biden, of course, on that refused to provide Israel with the armaments that it was, of course, expecting for the invasion of Rafah. And after doing so, Biden lost a lot of his pro-Israel base. He's losing a lot of those folks. Now, on this note, Biden is seeing criticism from Democrat members of Congress as well. It's not just his donors. And this is also happening on both sides. We saw the Squad, for example, the more far-left branch of the Democrat Party. They're getting really strong behind Palestine. In fact, some of them are getting behind like actual Hamas. Some of them are just not even trying to hide it, frankly. Some of them are kind of openly pro-terrorist, frankly. For example, one of them talking glowingly about Al-Qaeda and so on. Some of them are very extreme. But we were also seeing growing criticism from members who are pro-Israel among, again, the Democrats and their base. New York Post wrote that more than 24 House Democrats, led by Representative Josh Gottemeyer, told National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Friday they were deeply concerned about President Biden's decision to withhold military aid from Israel. It says Gottemeyer and 25 of his fellow lawmakers wrote in a letter to Sullivan obtained by the New York Post saying that, quote, withholding weapon shipments to Israel only emboldens our mutual enemies, including Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other Iran-backed proxies. They add that 7 months after October 7th, which is, of course, the day the Hamas attacked the Israel settlements, of course, and they call it the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the end of the Holocaust. They note as well that Iranian-backed terrorist proxies continue to fire rockets and mortars into Israel and at Americans from all directions. And they wrote as well that, quote, at the same time, anti-Semitism is spreading globally like wildfire. And that's putting Biden in a funny place because those anti-Israel protests are also being pretty heavily, let's say, by some of the major Democrat donors. And Biden is facing heavy criticism from the other side of his party, it turns out, because that not only does he have major donors on the side of Israel, again, he has major donors who are pro-Palestine and anti-Israel. I'll be talking more about this, though, after a quick break.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges. With a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold, you can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Hey, welcome back. President Joe Biden is facing criticism from congressional Democrats over withholding aid to Israel, and he's facing criticism from other congressional Democrats for not supporting Palestine enough. And as Biden tries to play both sides, he's interestingly kind of losing both sides. Now, as it happens right now, it turns out that not only does he have major donors on the side of Israel, some of the biggest Democrat voters are in that community, but Biden also has major donors who are pro-Palestine and anti-Israel. Politico noted this. Folks, you might remember recently, right? Before I jump into this, I did a piece a couple weeks ago about the financial channels behind the anti-Israel, pro-Palestine protests taking place at various American college campuses. And I noted there were ties to, notably far-left organizations. George Soros had money tied in with some of it. There was some Gates money. There's CCP ties, Chinese Communist Party ties behind some of it. And notably, some of the major actual openly Marxist organizations that were behind the protests are some of the same ones behind other Democrat far-left initiatives, like, for example, Black Lives Matter and so on. It's the same groups funding it. But, of course, the news on this has begun to come out more broadly. In fact, Politico had a piece kind of following up on what we reported. They said this. They said, President Joe Biden has been dogged for months by pro-Palestinian protesters, calling him Genocide Joe. It says, but some of the groups behind the demonstrations receive financial backing from philanthropists pushing hard for his re-election, oddly. Further in, it notes that two of the organizers supporting the protests at Columbia University and on other campuses are Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. So it notes that both are supported by the Tides Foundation, which is seeded by Democratic mega donor George Soros and was previously supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It notes that it in turn supports numerous small nonprofits that work for social change, like Marxist Revolution. It notes that Soros declined to comment, but a spokesperson with the Open Society Foundation, one of George Soros' main organizations, notes of which Soros is the founder and chairman, said in a statement that it has, quote, funded a broad spectrum of U.S. groups that have advocated for the rights of Palestinians and Israelis and for peaceful resolution to the conflict in Israel. It notes as well that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has previously funded the Tides Foundation as well and other groups, said it no longer has active grants to Tides, meaning they're I don't know if they're breaking from it, but they're not giving grants to it anymore. It notes that it also does not support Jewish Voice for Peace or If Not Now. And it notes that another notable Democrat donor whose philanthropy has helped the protest movement is David Rockefeller Jr., who it notes sits on the board of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. It has given nearly $500,000 directly to Jewish Voice for Peace, which explicitly describes itself as anti-Zionist over the past 5 years, it says. It notes that Rockefeller Brothers has separately given grants to both the Tides Foundation and the Tides Center. It notes as well that several other groups involved in pro-Palestinian protests are backed by a foundation funded by Susan and Nick Pritzker, heir to the Hyatt Hotel empire, and supporters of Biden and numerous Democratic campaigns, including $6,600 to the Biden Victory Fund a few months ago and more than $300,000 during the 2020 campaign. Now, again, it's getting complicated because these are some of the big names behind the money of the Democrat Party. And if, of course, they're divided over the Israel-Hamas issue, and of course Biden is the center of this whole thing, at least in their eyes, it's going to be problematic for Biden going into the elections. Even aside from Biden, the Democrat Party is fracturing over this issue, including some of the main power players behind the party. Again, Soros and Gates and Rockefeller and these other types, who are the ones who are kind of the lifeblood of it all. Now, again, some of these, like Soros, representing the more radical end of the Democrat Party, backing groups like, for example, the Squad, some of the groups behind the mass illegal migration, not just in the U.S., but in Europe as well, and other things. This more radical faction that could easily break away into a third party if they're not careful, which in some ways may be better for them, to be honest. Now, again, we recently on the show covered the financial sources behind the pro-Palestine protests, and we noted several openly Marxist organizations. We noted ties to radical left billionaires, and also we noted the Chinese Communist Party, maybe one of the biggest ones behind all of this. And this is where it gets really interesting. Some of the groups are even going after each other now. It's not just them going after Biden, they're actually turning on each other. Daily Mail noted that a progressive nonprofit is being sued by BLM, Black Lives Matter, for sponsoring pro-Palestine groups and fueling college campus protests, as well as withholding over $33 million in donations. It notes that Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation is suing Tides Foundation for fraud, according to a bombshell lawsuit. Folks, let that sit in. Black Lives Matter, and it's the Global Network Foundation they have behind it, is suing the Tides Foundation, one of the furthest left groups funding all these things, for fraud. And it's the group which has managed hundreds of millions of dollars for left-wing groups since its creation in 1976, has allegedly withheld BLM donations. As I mentioned before, Black Lives Matter used to get money from a lot of these groups that tend to finance what I would call Marxist revolution movements, groups that try to advocate the public into kind of radical action. Black Lives Matter, although I do think a lot of people in it, and a lot of people who maybe supported it, were not in agreement with the global movement behind it. The figureheads and the major forces behind it, including the major money, is in fact tied in with this massive network which does advocate for radical movements and so on, and including Marxist revolutionary groups. Remember, some of the BLM leaders were even saying that they were trained Marxists. They used to get money from this organization. This organization stopped giving them money, and now BLM is suing them. And especially because they seem to be unhappy that they're giving money to the Palestinian groups rather than their group. And note said in a 285-page lawsuit filed in California Supreme Court, Los Angeles County on Monday, it was alleged that Tides Foundation, quote, refused to honor its promises and continues to commandeer BLM, GNF, the BLM Global Foundation, donations. They're commandeering the donations to BLM, they claim. And it's the lawsuit claimed that the Tides Foundation, spread an undisclosed amount of donations to an unaffiliated radical BLM breakaway group spearheaded by anti-police activist Melina Abdullah. And look, it's pretty bizarre the way this is heading. I've mentioned repeatedly that when you have groups that of their basic modus operandi look for wrongdoing and issues everywhere they possibly can, they're always looking for fights. You can only create so many of those groups before they begin turning on each other. And you can only manufacture so many divisions among groups to where, again, you're not going to have risks of them turning against each other. And you can only create so many victim groups before they start forming caste systems of their own over who is the most victimized. And so, for example, are the black groups more victims than the Jewish groups? Are the Palestinian groups more victims than the Jewish groups? How do these groups interact? What about the trans groups? What about the feminist groups? What about the homosexual agenda type groups? All of them have found that they fall on different tiers of the leftist totem pole, and they're finding that some of them, again, maybe get more victim points than the others, and they're now seeing where those cards are falling. They're also finding that when these big financial organizations want to start radical movements, they tend to focus on one major issue at a time, which means that the ones that used to be, the favorite child, so to speak, are no longer getting the attention they used to get, and they start getting jealous, and they start fighting against the other ones, which we're now watching take place. Now, the cases are also raising awareness, notably, over who is financing the radical left in the United States, and also the very complex web of very radical groups tied in with all of this, because they're all interconnected. Tablet Magazine noted, But students are not the only and perhaps not even the most important faction active in the campus protests. Because as we've noticed, these college protests, on first glance, we would assume, oh, those are college kids. Those are these students at the universities, and they're deciding to go on their campuses to let their voices be heard over the issues they care about. That's not what's happening. In fact, it turns out most of the individuals arrested are not students, they're not teachers, they're not faculty, they're not people who are part of the schools in any way. Meaning, of course, there are radical groups getting involved in this, and they're the ones running most of the protests. Now, they note here that as in the mostly peaceful Black Lives Matter protests this summer of 2020, outside agitators, they claimed, right? Professional radicals and organizers, Black Bloc, Antifa thugs, Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries, and Palestinian and Islamist radicals have played a central role in organizing and escalating the campus protests, just as they have organized and escalated the wider anti-Israel protest campaign that began almost immediately after October 7th. Which is important, by the way, because that goes against the narrative that this is about the human rights of the Palestinian people. They were supporting Hamas initially. They were actually supporting the terrorist attack, not necessarily protesting the response from Israel. The initial protests began almost immediately after October 7th. They were pro-Hamas. Now, it notes here that this largely decentralized network of agitators is, in turn, politically and financially supported by a vast web of progressive nonprofits, NGOs, foundations, and dark money groups ultimately backed by big money donors aligned with the Democratic Party. Because again, what we're seeing is that they tend to do these mass movements during election seasons. They tend to do these mass movements when they want something. They tend to do these mass movements as a type of Hegelian action meant to create noise to change policy. They create noise here so the politicians here can react to it and say the people demand change, the people demand us to pass new legislation, and they change it. But behind them you have these mega donors and strategists and NGOs and otherwise that are playing both sides. NGOs funding the protesters, big billionaires funding the protesters, working oftentimes through NGOs, and big billionaires funding the politicians who they have reacting to the same thing they're funding on the other side. This has been described as an above and below strategy. You control the politicians, you control the popular movements, and you control this whole thing like a giant puppet show to achieve in society the policies you want to enact. That is how the dang thing works. And on this front as well, we're seeing that there's divisions now taking place within that system, within the system that puppeteers these types of movements. We're now seeing they're not getting along anymore. We're seeing that they're clashing. We're seeing they're losing control of the grassroots organizations. We're seeing there's backlash within their own factions. And back to this article, it says, what you're seeing is a real witch's brew of revolutionary content interacting on campus, says Kyle Schidler, the director for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., and an expert, it says, on far-left domestic extremism. He says that, quote, on the left-wing side, you have a broad variety of revolutionary leftists who serve as rent-a-mobs, folks, providing the warm bodies for whatever the leftist cause of the day is. And on the other side, you have the Islamist and Palestinian networks, American Muslims for Palestine and their subsidiary Students for Justice in Palestine, CARE, the Palestinian Youth Movement. He says we're seeing a real mixture of different kinds of radical foment, and it's all being activated at the same time. Now, it notes as well further in that the far-left groups active in the protests at the schools and so on include Antifa and other anarchists. Anarchist literature has been distributed in the encampments, and Antifa websites have published dispatches from quote-unquote comrades on the inside. And notes they also include various communist and Marxist-Leninist groups. including the Maoist Revolutionary Communist Party, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and the International Answer Coalition, a PSL front group that worked with several Muslim groups to organize the January 13th march on Washington for Gaza, at which protesters flew the black jihadist flag, it says. It notes as well that on October 29th, for instance, shortly before masked assailants stormed Columbia's Hamilton Hall and barricaded themselves inside the People's Forum, a Manhattan event, which I exposed previously. The People's Forum, a Manhattan event space affiliated with the PSL and funded by Neville Roy Singham, a wealthy businessman who, quote, works closely with the Chinese government media machine and is financing its propaganda worldwide, according to an August profile, ironically in the New York Times of all places, urged its activists to rush up to Columbia to support our students, it says. It notes that similar calls for an emergency action were distributed throughout radical networks in New York City. Meaning, again, it's all the far left and communist and Maoist organizations and even Islamist and pro-terrorist organizations all coming out at once, and they're notably turning on their masters. They're turning on the Democrat Party. They're biting the hand that feeds them. And interestingly as well, the mega donors, the big money behind these mass movements, they are fighting amongst themselves, it seems, because as well we're seeing that they don't seem to agree with what Biden is doing, and Biden is caught, as I mentioned earlier, between a rock and a hard place, because a lot of the big money behind the Democrat Party is also on the Zionist and pro-Israel side. He also has big money on that side. Now look, the growing rifts within the Democrat Party and the far left have them concerned about the upcoming Democratic National Convention, where we could possibly watch all these conflicts just spark and come to a head. And so to avoid that, they're planning to make part of the conference online only. And they're taking steps to prevent focus shifting to potential protests within their own party, because the Democrat Party risks fracturing over these issues. The far left, the Marxists, the socialists, there's a chance they could break away from the party. At the very least, they're not agreeing with the general direction the party is in right now. I'll be talking about this, though, and also how Biden is getting some backup on the campaign trail only on EpochTV.com. So for those of you joining us on YouTube, Facebook, X, Rumble, click on the link below and come join us on EpochTV.com. It's our uncensored streaming platform that's not afraid to report the truth as it should be reported. And, you know, with your subscription, not only will you get access to the rest of this episode and my show in general, but also the live Q&A where I answer your questions. You'll also get access to my documentaries, including my latest one on what's really happening at the border. It's called Weapons of Mass Migration. And in it, of course, I go down to Panama, I go to the U.S.-Mexico border, and I show the systems in place that are facilitating mass migration. Notably, what we're being shown on the surface, what we've been told is not really the case. The illegal mass migration into the United States is an operation that our own government has agreed to be part of. Again, the Global Compact for Migration, including the cash handouts, part of the grand bargain, through which our own government has agreed to give illegal aliens and others your tax dollars in the form of cash envelopes and even debit cards, prepaid debit cards. We are paying them money to illegally immigrate to the United States and come here and get a bunch of free handouts. And a lot of people might be asking, well, why are they doing that? Why do they want to bring in literally millions of illegal aliens from every part of the world? Why are they funding it? Why are they running it? Why are they doing this and not telling us about it? Well, that's one of the big questions we try to ask in this documentary. And we get, of course, into elections. We get, of course, into globalist agendas. And we get, of course, into the real issues that this country should be discussing. So if you want to watch Weapons of Mass Migration, click on the link below and you'll be on your way. We'll also be doing a live panel.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention?
Sorry, we're in New York.
I'll
I'll also be doing a live panel tomorrow night at 7 p.m. That'll be on Weapons of Mass Migration. I'll be joined by some experts in breaking down the latest on the border. So if you want to watch that, make sure to join us 7 p.m. Eastern Time on epochtv.com. And I apologize, we're in New York, so you get this every now and then. Let me show you a trailer for Weapons of Mass Migration, and we'll continue the show.
An unrelenting stream of immigration. Non-stop.
According to statistics, around 7.2 million illegal immigrants entered the United States under President Joe Biden alone. They have United Nations facilities here, and the people pushing this are leading people to their deaths.
To what extent is the United Nations facilitating the border crisis?
They're throwing rocks!
They're being overridden by international powers.
We are not authorized to talk.
It is a humanitarian business now.
And they said, oh yeah, these are the debit cards. We're giving these debit cards to the immigrants.
Why all the cloak and dagger? Why are we being so stealthy about this?
Some of these people have gone on record and publicly talked about this. People close to Barack Obama.
It puts 12 million people on the path to citizenship and eventually voters.
I've been researching, of course, what's happening, but I want to know why it's happening.
We'll see chaos on a global scale until America is extinguished and the power shifts completely to the east.